Almost half of the victims of the earthquake in Haiti were under the age of 18, which means about 500,000 children were cast into the streets, into crowded orphanages, or makeshift camps. Untold thousands of kids were separated from their families, threatened by hunger, disease, sexual assault, and even a modern-day slave trade. This past winter, in the aftermath of the quake, we spent 6 weeks around Port-au-Prince with an American charity called the Global Orphan Project. We found an emergency that was still unfolding as rescue workers raced the clock to save the lost children of Haiti.
The story will continue in a moment.
10 weeks after, Haitians walked an apocalyptic landscape. Many couldn't be certain of food or shelter, and for families with missing loved ones, it was impossible to know who was living and who was dead. Survivors raised urban campsites of sticks and cloth and plastic. It was crowded. Water and sanitation were poor. When we arrived in January, the Good Samaritan orphanage outside Port-au-Prince was overwhelmed. Even before the earthquake, orphanages like this were common because desperate families often feel forced to abandon their children to the care of others. But now, new arrivals were pouring in. We found Moise Vival and Joe Knittig of the Global Orphan Project as they rushed food and tents to desperate orphanages.
One of them, when we showed up the first time, had 1 cup of flour, and the children were asking their pastor, the caretaker, whether they were going to die.
They had 1 container of flour for how many?
Not a container, a cup.
At this children's home, when the quake hit, the kids just happened to be in a prayer service under this mango tree. Their building crumbled. Global Orphan discovered the children.
We're really excited to have you come with us.
Loaded up the survivors, and checked them into an emergency camp that it set up outside the capital. Moise Vival is Global Orphan's country director and a Haitian pastor. While he was helping hundreds of orphans, we learned that he was also looking for his own missing son. 8-year-old Jean-Marc didn't come home from school after the quake.
Jean-Marc is a lovely child, a charming guy. Anybody who meets him, man or woman, you'll fall in love with him.
You did something that I think is quite remarkable. You came back to work.
We were looking for one, but there were hundreds here that took care for.
You were looking for one, your son,
my son,
but there were hundreds here to care for. Vival didn't know whether his boy was dead, injured, or lost. We followed his search over the next 6 weeks, a search common to many thousands of Haitians.
How is it possible to know how many lost children there are in Haiti now?
The answer is we don't know. We feel it's upwards of 50,000.
50,000?
Yeah.
Marie de la Soudière is responsible for UNICEF's program to unite lost children with their families. It's a monumental task because kids were off in school when the earthquake hit, and 5,000 schools were destroyed.
Comment on peut la trouver, la maison?
It's detective work. She coaxes leads from the children, addresses, neighborhoods, relatives that they remember. This girl, who didn't want to talk, finally did draw her family in a happier time and began to open up.
Either the child is too young to remember enough or fairly traumatized, and then it takes a lot more time. But in my experience, and I don't think it's going to be any different in this country, 95% of the families can be found.
95%? You have that much hope?
Oh, yeah. Even little ones. You just can't give up. Never give up.
When we met her, de la Soudière's team had registered 600 kids and reunited 20 with their families. It was a small start. Going forward now, weeks after the earthquake, what worries you?
That children disappeared without their parents' knowledge, that we have desperate parents looking out there every day. I get parents saying, could you find my child? And that they end up in wretched orphanages without even anybody knowing they're there.
We caught up with Pastor Vival again in early February. It had taken weeks to gear up the registration of lost children. Vival took a break from his work at the Global Orphan Project to go with his wife to the Red Cross to report Jean-Marc as a missing person. He also returned to his son's school. This is Jean-Marc's school, pancaked all the way down to the ground. And these are some of the desks that the children were using when the earthquake hit. We don't have any idea how many kids are still entombed in this building, but it is many. It is a terrible thing to contemplate, but the fact is, for thousands of Haitian families, they will never know whether their children were killed. And if their children lived, they may never find out what became of them. Maybe it was to keep his mind occupied, but Vival was working night and day. He traveled to neighboring islands to check on orphans, and he preached to his own congregation amid the rubble of his broken church. He told us, no matter what happened to Jean-Marc, his son was in the hands of God.
I never worry about tomorrow. Never. Tomorrow will be good because it's in God's hand.
The Global Orphan Project was started by Mike and Beth Fox of Kansas City. He'd made a fortune in business, so 7 years ago they decided to give back with just a few orphanages.
We were going to do maybe 10 homes.
How many orphanages do you have now, worldwide?
Oh, 130, 140. We have 20 locations in Haiti. We have several in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Thailand, the Philippines, a couple, one in Trinidad, Honduras, and then the rest are in Africa.
In Haiti, Global Orphan was already caring for more than 2,000 children before the quake. Now, they were taking on more. We met 13-year-old Renice in the camp. Rescue workers had picked her up from the quake-ravaged streets. It's hard to believe, but the quake was to her a blessing. It ended a nightmare of a childhood. Months before the quake, Renice was raped and became pregnant. But there was more. She was also the victim of something almost unimaginable in this day and time. Renice had been given away as a child to become a household slave for another family.
There were moments when I would just stop and cry. I cried because they made me work like a donkey. Their daughter never picked up one bucket when I was there, not once.
They didn't treat you like their daughter.
Not at all. I used to sleep on the floor.
The daughter slept in the bed and you slept on the floor, is that right?
Yes.
Child slaves in Haiti are called restivex, which in Creole means stays with, as in one who stays with the family but isn't part of the family. It's a grotesque tradition, especially for a country born out of a slave rebellion. But it is not illegal. The UN estimates that there are about 175,000 restivex. That may sound like a huge number, but others believe there are many more.
If there are 300 or 400,000 restivex children in Haiti, those children are me. They are who I was.
Jean-Robert Cadet was a restivec who was given away by his father when he was 4 years old.
The worst abuse that you suffered was what?
The worst abuse, wow. I was beaten, I would say, almost every morning. A lot of time it's not the beating, which is the worst abuse. I mean, you're a child, you get a beating, it's over. But it's when the family leaves the house and they lock the house and leave you outside all day long without food.
When they leave the house, they lock it up and leave you outside?
Absolutely. And they still do that today.
Now Cadet believes children left alone by the earthquake will suffer in slavery.
They would be absorbed into the communities as restivex. Friends will pick them up, distant relative, an uncle or an aunt. Yes, they will become restivex.
The earthquake created slaves.
The earthquake created more slaves. Not create slaves, create more slaves.
As a boy, Cadet moved with his owners to America. Eventually, they threw him out. But with a teacher's help, he managed to finish school, become a U.S. Army Ranger, and then a teacher himself.
We're going to talk. I'm going to give him some options.
These days, Cadet works to free child slaves, but since keeping a Restavek isn't illegal, he has to persuade owners to release the kids.
You can tell she has scars. She is worked severely. And you can see her face. She has scars on her face. He said she's well, there's nothing wrong with her.
He wasn't able to talk this woman into releasing the girl.
And out of the more than 300,000 slave children in this country, you think you can make a difference? Pulling them out of families one at a time?
You have to know, somebody made a big difference in my life. You know, somebody did. And that person was a teacher. And this man helped me get into the welfare system. He tutored me every day. He gave me a chance. And I can come here to my country to make a difference in those kids' lives. So saving one is worth it to me. It's worth it.
Renice, the pregnant girl from the emergency camp, is one who has been saved from a life of servitude. She's planning to go back to school, and Global Orphan was speaking with a Haitian family about adopting her baby. By the end of our 6 weeks, Global Orphan had taken in over 400 lost kids.
There we go.
It rebuilt that orphanage by the mango tree that we saw earlier, and it delivered tents and food to another 15 orphanages.
Ça va bien?
Some were getting just a little bit better. 10 weeks after the quake, we went back to Jean-Marc's school. They had brought in heavy equipment and were digging through the rubble. It was then that Moise Vival was pulled away from his work at the Orphan Project by a call from the workers at the site. They had found a book bag that belonged to Jean-Marc. And not long after, his weeks of wandering came to an end. A few days later, he brought his family to his own church for the funeral service of Jean-Marc. He told us the moment was a grace from God, a blessing that he was able to bury his boy in a time when so many others do not know the fate of their children. In March, that former child slave, Renice, gave birth to a baby girl and named her Kimberly. The adoption didn't go through, so mother and child now live together at the emergency camp. A nanny is on duty so that Renice can go to school for the very first time.